Hello, everyone. Praise the Lord. And now we are going to continue in this class with the chapter on Synoptic Gospels. So, in the last class, we spoke about the Gospels, about how the Gospels were written and what were the Gospels, the definition, and everything. And we also spoke about the synoptic problem and what does the word synoptics mean. Okay, so today in this class, we are going to take a survey of the synoptic Gospels, that is Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So we'll not waste more time. We'll just get into it and we'll start studying the books of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Okay, so as we have this before us, this is again the unit 8, survey of the Gospels and Acts of the Apostle, lesson 22, survey of the Synoptic Gospels, part 2. So we have already done the past part 1. Now we are going to do the part 2. Okay, now we're going to start with the Gospel of Mark. So we'll do the Gospel of Mark first, and then Luke, and then, Matthew. Yeah, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, because Mark was written first. So we're going to talk about Mark first. Okay, so Gospel of Mark. Let's look at the characteristics of the Gospel of Mark. Mark happens to be the smallest of all the Gospels. Okay, but it has long narratives. Okay, so it is supposed to be, or it is considered to be the smallest of all the Gospels. It concentrates on the deeds of Jesus more than his words. Okay, so the Gospel of Mark, it goes very quick. And this happened, and then this happened, and immediately this, and immediately, and immediately, and immediately. These are the words. Okay, suddenly, immediately. Okay, these are the words that Mark uses very often. Okay, so he concentrates on the deeds of Jesus, the movement, action, the quick movement. Okay, he concentrates on those. So that's how it moves. It moves swiftly. It moves quick. He's concentrating on the deeds of Jesus Christ rather than his words. On the other hand, we see Matthew. Matthew concentrates mainly on what Jesus says. Okay, Matthew concentrates mainly on what Jesus says, but Mark concentrates on the marvelous things Jesus did and the places he went swiftly, suddenly, immediately, okay, using all those words. Mark uses terse and full of words, full of action. Okay, he uses terse words, terse expressions, and expressions that is full of action. He narrates the story literally as they happened. Okay, as if something is happening before you, because it's like action. Okay, he talks about the deeds, so it's something like he's narrating something that is happening visually in front of you with expressions. Okay, so he's just doing that. So he talks about actions. That is why we say, okay, so he narrates the stories literally as they happened, moving swiftly from Jesus's baptism to his preaching and performing miracles, and moving on to his crucial events on the cross and resurrection. He moves very swiftly and very quickly. He records around 18 miracles and emphasizes Jesus' ministry of exorcism. Okay, his main focus, as you can say, is on the ministry of Jesus as of exorcism ministry. Okay, so he records around 18 miracles and emphasizes on Jesus' ministry of exorcism. Authorship. Let's look at the author. The title of the gospel, according to Mark, almost certainly refers to John Mark. Okay, John Mark. Do you remember John Mark? Is mentioned in Acts chapter 12, verse 25 as the author. Okay, he belonged to Jerusalem and was a nephew of Barnabas, who was an important member of the church of at Jerusalem. Okay, Mark was closely associated with Peter. We can see in Acts chapter 12, verse 12, when Peter was released from prison, he went to the home of Mary. Okay, who was this Mary? This Mary was the mother of Mark John or John Mark, where the church was meeting for prayer. Okay, so as soon as Peter was released from the prison, he went to a house which was gathered. He knocked at the door, and the one girl comes and sees and says, "Oh, she thought that it is the booth or of Peter." Okay, so they did not believe that Peter would be released. Okay, that's what we read over there. Okay, so he goes straight to the house of Mary. Mary was the mother of John Mark. Okay, and where the church was meeting together for prayer, and they were praying for them. They were praying for the disciples. They were praying for Peter. So homes at that time, we can say they were important places for meeting. Some scholars suggest that probably this was the upper room where the Holy Spirit was poured out on the disciples. So if this was the case, then Mark would have been the same person who told the story of Mark in Mark, as it is mentioned in chapter 14, verse 51 to 52, who was following Jesus. Okay, the one who was following, he says, I was following Jesus. Okay, who was following Jesus and his disciples up to the Garden of Gethsemane, as he as gives his testimony saying, I was there. He says that I was there. Okay, so probably this was the same person who was following. Okay, the author was the same person who was following them. So he was involved with Paul and Barnabas in their first missionary journey. Paul, who refused to take him the second missionary journey, and called him as a deserter. Okay, if you remember, there was a split in the teams where Barnabas took this John Mark, Mark, okay, John Mark, and Paul took somebody else, okay, at that time. So we have to understand that there was a split at that time. Barnabas trusted, Barnabas was a cousin of Mark, okay, and he trusted Mark, okay, though he had deserted them earlier, but he trusted Mark and he went along with Mark, but Paul went with Silas at that time. Okay, so they parted ways at that time. And at that time, Paul refused to take Mark on the second missionary journey, and he called him as a deserter because earlier he had left them. Okay, but later on we see in 2 Timothy chapter 4 verse 11 that Paul says about him, he is helpful for me in my ministry. So his view of Mark had changed, and Mark had developed to be a very impressive person in ministry. Peter calls him my son, who was with him in Rome. Okay, so he was closely associated with Peter, who worked with him in Rome. Okay, First Peter chapter 5, verse 31. The early church was unanimous on 2 points, okay, regarding this gospel. The early church was unanimous or in one stand on 2 points regarding the gospel. Firstly, that it was written by Mark. They were fully confirmed, they were fully affirmed, they were fully of this belief or viewpoint that Mark wrote this gospel. Secondly, it was based on the teachings of Peter. Okay, second thing that they believed properly and fully was that the gospel of Mark is based on the teachings of Peter. Peter the apostle, Peter the disciple. Okay, so the two things that the church was completely unanimous about was, first thing, that this gospel was written by Mark. Second thing, that this gospel was based on the teachings of Peter. Okay, so Mark gives a summary of the message of Peter. That's what we have in the gospel of Mark. So Mark gives the message or the summary of the message of Peter. Okay, so this is basically Peter's version written by Mark. Okay, that's what we can understand. Date, let's look at the time when it was written. Most of the scholars believe that it was written in 65 to 70 AD. Some say it was written in 50 AD. Okay, so probably, if, but we can see that most of the scholars stand with the previous view, that is 65 to 70 AD. Okay, let's move ahead. Let's talk about the audience. It was probably written from Rome. Okay, he wrote from Rome for the Roman Gentile Christians. Okay, whom was he writing to? To the Roman Gentile Christians, and he was probably writing from Rome itself. This seems clear that Mark is seen explaining the Jewish customs. Okay, because he's writing to the Romans and the Roman Gentile Christians, they do not understand the Jewish customs. Okay, they do not understand the Jewish customs. So when Mark is writing to them, he has to explain things to them. So there are terms that he's explaining, like what Jesus said to the sick person, what Tabitha kum and Talitha kum, and then on the cross, what all things were happening. So whatever Jesus was speaking in his Aramaic language, whatever he's speaking in this Jewish language, the Jewish customs and everything. So when Mark is writing it down, he is explaining it. He is interpreting it also, so that these Roman Christians, Gentile Christians, may also understand. So this seems clear that by reading this, okay, that Mark is seen explaining the Jewish customs, translating the Aramaic expressions, using Latin terms for the measurements, and recording the confessions of a Roman centurion at the cross, 1539 chapter mein. we can see, we can understand that this is what his audience were, and that is why he is explaining. There is a need for explanation of these Jewish terms and Jewish customs and Jewish Aramaic expressions and phrases and everything. Okay, so that is why he is explaining everything in his gospel. These small small terms that we have, he is explaining them. Okay, since Mark's audience primarily composed of believers who probably were very familiar with the major events of the life of Jesus Christ, he does not attempt to write the exhaustive biography of Jesus, but presents an abbreviated account of his life and work. So, what happened was probably when Mark was writing this, he knew that his audience knows about the life of Jesus. Okay, about the biography kind of a thing, they know properly about Jesus. Okay, so you don't have to repeat it because my audience knows this. I can move ahead. I can build up on this knowledge that they know this. Okay, so Mark built his gospel on the knowledge that the people, the Roman Gentile Christians, they knew about the life of Jesus very well. They knew about the life of Jesus very well, and on that knowledge, he built up the further of his what he wanted to say to them. Okay, and in an abbreviated version, in short, he spoke about the Jesus's life, and then he moved ahead and talked about the deeds and the events that happened. Okay, so this was to present him as the Messiah. So he wanted to present Jesus as the Messiah and to provide the church with a dynamic model of Christian life and service during the time of persecution. So this was his aim. What did he want to do? He wanted to present Jesus as a Messiah. Okay, he wanted to present Jesus as a Messiah, and he wanted to provide the church with this dynamic model, with this amazing model of Christian life that is found in Jesus, Christian service that is found in Jesus, okay, which will sustain them in the times of persecution. So he wanted to build the lives of these Gentile Christians so that they do not sway at the time of persecution. They are not swayed at the time of persecution, but they will stand strong on the knowledge that Jesus is the Messiah, and this is how they should live. This is how they should serve. Okay, let's move ahead and let's talk about the outline. So the chapter 1, Mark chapter 1, verses 1 to 13 are the opening events of Jesus's ministry. Mark chapter 1, verse 14 to chapter 3, verse 6 is Jesus's early Galilean ministry. Then we have Mark 3, verse 7 to chapter 7, verse 23. We have the second phase of Galilean ministry. Then we have chapter 7, verse 24 to 9:50, third phase of Galilean ministry. Then we have 10, verse 1 to verse 52, Jesus' journey to Jerusalem. Mark 11, verse 1 to 15, verse 47, Jesus' final week in Jerusalem. Then we have chapter 16, verse 1 to verse 8, Jesus' resurrection. Then last section is called a longer ending of Mark, which is not found in every version. It is chapter 16, verses 9 to 20. Let's talk about the longer and the shorter ending. Okay, according to most of the ancient authorities, Mark ends abruptly in chapter 16, verse 8. Okay, and there is nothing beyond that. Okay, with the woman feeling the fear at the tomb. So he ends over there only. Probably Mark ends over there only, where the woman see the tomb and they are very fearful at that time. Okay, the rest of it is not found in the most ancient authority scriptures. Okay, so as this end seems inconclusive, okay, inconclusive and abrupt, because this is just suddenly ending over there where the women are fearful. It does not give a good ending over there. It is very inconclusive and does not talk about the future, does not, it's very abrupt. So many believe that the final part of the manuscript was missing. Probably it was lost or it is missing. So which was dated from 2nd century. And we can see that in the 2nd century, the longer ending was added. So the verses from 9 to 20 were added in the 2nd century. So before that, it was only up to chapter 16, verse 8, ending abruptly. Okay, there was no conclusion, nothing. It was just an abrupt end. But to give it a finer ending, just to conclude it in a proper way, in second century we can see the larger ending was added. That is from verses 9 to 20. This included in all the modern translations, either as a footnote or as a main text after a line with a footnote. Okay, so if you're in your Bibles also, you will see in the modern versions also, you will see either this portion is found in the footnote or this portion will be found. There will be a line, short line drawn, and then after that, this portion 9 to 20 would be written, and in the footnote they would have said this is the longer ending or the reference of it. Okay, so only the earlier authorities concluded with a shorter ending of only one verse, which is given in the NRSV along with the longer ending. We cannot take this as a genuine ending because it was added late. Okay, it was added in the second century. But some believe that in the manuscript, the part went missing or it was lost. So we do not know what was written after chapter 16, verse 8, but it sounds very abrupt ending over there with the fear, ending with fear, which should not be the case of a gospel. Okay, so it was added on later on. Okay, now this was the Gospel of Mark. Let's move to the Gospel of Matthew. Okay, the Gospel of Matthew. Among all the four Gospels, the Gospel of Matthew was highly valued from the initial days. It was highly valued and it was widely read and considered to be the most important among all the early churches. Okay, so we'll see why and what happened, why it was done so. So Matthew's gospel was always the favorite. Matthew's gospel was highly valued. It was considered to be the most important gospel by the early church. It was thus placed, because of this, it was placed in as a first book or the first gospel of the New Testament canon. Reason, it contains a genealogy. It begins with a genealogy. Okay, it begins with a genealogy with which proved a convenient link between the Old and the New Testament. Okay, so because it has a genealogy, it connected the Old Testament with the New Testament. That is why it is placed as a first book. Okay, first book, because it connected the old to the new through its genealogy. It was the most quoted gospel. Okay, why it is so famous? Because it was the most quoted gospel before 180 AD. Because firstly, Matthew's apostolic authority was linked with it. Okay, because Matthew was a apostle. Matthew was the disciple of Jesus. Okay, so his authority, his apostolic authority, was linked with his gospel as he was the author of it. Secondly, it contains details of Jesus's teachings. It contains detailed teachings of Jesus. So these are the two main factors why the Gospel of Matthew was quoted more often than the other Gospels. Firstly, because it had Matthew's apostolic authority as he was the author of it. Secondly, it contained detailed teachings of Jesus. So Matthew's basic reference was Mark. So Matthew referred to Mark's gospel. It was one of the major sources that he had when he was writing the gospel. Okay, so but it differs from Mark as Mark moves rapidly from action to action, and Matthew's concentration is on the teachings, on the words of Jesus, on the teachings of Jesus, on the kingdom, on the teachings of Jesus about the kingdom of heaven and the Sermon on the Mount. Okay, so he's more concerned about the teachings of Jesus. Okay, though he has taken the material, most of the material from Mark's gospel as his source, but we can see the way he has written is more concentrating on the words of Jesus, the teachings of Jesus. Okay, so his teaching can be collected or segregated in 5 sections. The teaching on the kingdom of heaven also becomes a link between the Old and the New Testament in terms of the move from the old Israel to the new worldwide church of God's people. Okay, so he talks about the kingdom of heaven. He talks about the kingdom of heaven. Okay, so he connects kingdom of heaven is more acceptable by the Jewish people. The term kingdom of heaven is more acceptable by the Jewish people. So this term, the kingdom of heaven, it connects the Old Testament with the New Testament. So he moves, progresses in the terms of from old Israel, he moves towards and widens up as a church of God's people. Okay, so he is in progression. It's a progression that is seen through genealogy, and it is a progression that is seen movement from old Israel to the new worldwide church of God's people. Matthew's gospel contains a lot of teachings on the church. Therefore, he was so widely quoted in the growing early church, and it is needed and it needed the authoritative word of Christ to instruct the new believers and combat the heresy. Okay, so why there were so many references taken, or why was Matthew's gospel quoted so often in the early churches? The reason is that Matthew has so much teachings of Jesus regarding the church. Okay, so many teachings on the church, about the church. Okay, therefore he was so widely quoted because he was actually bringing out the teachings of Jesus for the church. Okay, in the instructions of Jesus for the church, how Jesus would instruct the new church, the believers, and how the teachings of Jesus can combat the wrong teachings or the heresies or the false teachings. Okay, so all those things can be found in Matthew, and thus the early churches quoted so much from the Gospel of Matthew. Now let's look at the authorship. The first gospel, like the other synoptic gospels, is anonymous. So he did not have any author's name. Okay, Mark's gospel did not have any author's name. Matthew's gospel also did not have any author's name. But from the very beginning, from the earliest times, it has been attributed to Matthew. The church fathers and everyone just linked this gospel to Matthew. And who is this Matthew? Matthew, the disciple of Christ, the tax collector by profession. Okay, so he is the person whom this writing has been linked with. So the title, according to Matthew, could have been according to Matthew. Okay, that means gospel according to Matthew. This title could have been added later on by the early church fathers so that his authorship will be acceptable for all. Next, let's move to the audience. Whom was this gospel written to? Matthew wrote this gospel to the Jewish readers to convince them that Jesus is the Messiah and that he has ushered in the promised kingdom of heaven. Okay, Matthew wanted to tell to the people, the Jewish people, he was Jewish by birth. Okay, he was a Jewish, and though he was a tax collector, but he was Jewish and he was not liked by the Jewish people. So and the Jewish people had actually rejected Jesus also, okay, because he was dining with the tax collectors, he was with the sinners and everyone. Okay, so Matthew's main focus while he's writing the gospel, is that to convince the people that Jesus is the Messiah. Jesus is the Messiah. That Jesus is the Messiah, and he has ushered in, or called in, or he has introduced, or he has begun the kingdom of heaven as was promised by the prophets. Okay, he is the Messiah, and he has inaugurated and he has introduced the kingdom of heaven. The proof of it can be seen in the way he has written the gospel. The genealogy, okay, the genealogy, just for example, the genealogy, he begins with David. Okay, he begins a genealogy with David. Why? Okay, David, in the sense, he talks about David. Okay, David is a very central point of his genealogy. Okay, so why? His emphasis that Jesus is from the Davidic lineage. He wants to emphasize that Jesus is from the Davidic lineage, because from his lineage only the Messiah would come. Okay, so he's emphasizing, or he's kept it David in the center. Pehle और David के बाद. Okay, so he kept David in the center, and he says that Jesus is from the lineage of David. Then he talks of the kingdom of heaven. He does not say kingdom of God. He says kingdom of heaven. Okay, rather than the kingdom of God, because it was a more acceptable term for the Jewish ears. If they found it more better, they accepted that term as kingdom of heaven more than the kingdom of God. Its structure. Okay, now the structure. The structure was like a Christian Pentateuch. You remember Pentateuch, the first five books of the Old Testament. Okay, so this Matthew's gospel, it has 5 teachings. Okay, Matthew's gospel has 5 teachings. So first 5 books, as you can say. Secondly, it's like the structure Christian Pentateuch. It's like a Christian Pentateuch with the Sermon on the Mount taking place as the law giving at Mount Sinai. Okay, he has very smartly done that. Matthew has very smartly, done these things, very thoughtfully done these things, so that he can convince the Jewish readers. So just like the laws were given to Moses on Mount Sinai, that was a mount, and now here is another mount, that is this Sermon on the Mount. Now Jesus is giving these teachings, the five set of teachings, the teachings, okay, the teachings on Mount, the Sermon in the Mount, the Sermon on the Mount. Okay, so that is why there is one Mount Sinai where the laws were given, and then in Matthew there is the Sermon on the Mount, equally important. Okay, so he is like connecting both. He's like connecting both. This highlight. Okay, so that's how he did. That's how he tries to convince his Jewish audience. It's very unique way. It's very it's if we learn to understand how Matthew has written the gospel, it's it's very strange, very unique, and very intelligently written. Okay, very intelligently written. He was very intelligent in writing the gospel. Okay, the Matthew's gospel. Okay, let's move ahead. Let's see the characteristic of Matthew's gospel. Uh, Firstly, it is a teaching gospel par excellence. Teaching gospel par excellence that greatly supplements Mark, who is more interested in what Jesus did than what he said. Okay, so there was already Mark, what was written. Okay, Mark was talking about the deeds of Jesus. To supplement these deeds of Jesus, now Matthew's gospel is there, who talks about the teachings of Jesus, the words of Jesus. So if you see Mark's gospel and if you see Matthew's gospel, they would complement each other. They would complement each other in the sense that Mark talks about the deeds and Matthew talks about the words of Jesus. So they together go very well, and they complement each other and supplement each other. Secondly, it is the gospel of the church. Okay, it is the gospel of the church, and it emphasizes the church as God's vision. He says that the church is God's vision, and he anticipates the emergence of the problems in the church with a teaching on the church discipline and lifestyle. So we can see that through the teachings of Jesus, he provides solutions to the problems of the church and disciplined lifestyle of the church or the believers. Thirdly, it is a gospel of fulfillment. Okay, this is very important, the way he has written the gospel of fulfillment. And he points out that Christianity is the fulfillment of Old Testament revelation. Okay, Christianity is the fulfillment of the Old Testament revelation with continuous repetition of the phrase that it might be fulfilled, that it might be fulfilled. So if you can remember, if you read the Gospel of Matthew, you will find that this statement, that it might be fulfilled. So this happened so that this might be fulfilled. He said this so that this might be fulfilled. This happened so that this might be fulfilled. This happened so that this might be fulfilled. This is how Matthew writes. Okay, so it's like prophetic way. He's writing in a prophetic way, so that this happened. He's connecting it with the prophecies so that this might be fulfilled. This what was said might be fulfilled. So he says that everything, like we can say, understand that Christianity is the fulfillment of the Old Testament revelation. And he does that. He tells that, okay, this has been fulfilled. This has been fulfilled. This was prophesied and it has been fulfilled. This was prophesied and it has been fulfilled. That is how he moves ahead. That is how Matthew moves ahead in his gospel. He emphasizes the messiahship of Jesus. Okay, he emphasizes on the messiahship of Jesus. Christianity as the new law. Okay, he emphasizes Jesus as the messiahship. Jesus is messiahship, and then he emphasizes on the Christianity as the new law and the similarity of Jesus's life to that of children of Israel. Okay, children of Israel going to Egypt in their infancy. How the Israel was first infancy, it had gone to Egypt in his infancy, and then it was called out of it. Okay, how through Moses they were taken out of it. In the same way, Jesus also was taken into Egypt in his infancy, and then he was called out of it from there, and then there was a new life that began. Okay, so he connects this thing of Jesus's life with the initial days of Israel's life, where they were taken into Egypt and then they came out from there. Okay, in the same way that Jesus also was called out from Egypt. Okay, this was we can see that is one of the highlights in the characteristics of Gospel of Matthew. Now, fourth characteristic, it is the Gospel of the King. Okay, it is the Gospel of the King. With this genealogy being traced back to David, the king of the coming of Magi at his birth, asking, where is the king of Jews? Okay, these things you have to note it down. This is very interesting, the way he has tried to portray Jesus as the king. Okay, he traces his genealogy back to Jesus's genealogy back to King David, showing that he is the son of King David. Okay, the lineage of King David. And then he talks about the Magi. He's the only one who's talking about the Magi. Okay, Magi who came at the birth of Jesus. And what did they ask? They asked, where is the king of Jews? 8 times he gives Jesus the regal title or calls Jesus as a son of David. It can be through anybody. Okay, so he called him as son of David. He assigned that quote to him, son of David. Then we can see the triumphal entrance with its kingly significance. Okay, he portrays this triumphal entrance as a kingly significance, as if a king is entering into Jerusalem. Then Pilate's question, are you the king of Jews? Okay, are you the king of Jews? With Jesus' tacit reply, it is as you say. Jesus is accepting here. It is as you say. Okay, the words over the cross, this is Jesus, the king of the Jews. Okay, so that board, that the plate that was nailed on the cross of Jesus on top, it was written, this is Jesus, the king of Jews. And the climax in the Great Commission, all authority in heaven and on earth is given to me. Okay, so all these things tell that Jesus is the king. Okay, so this is very beautifully portrayed and this is very beautifully written by Matthew. Now let's look at the outline. As a teaching gospel, the teaching is divided into 5 sections, all following the narratives portion. Okay, so first Matthew chapter 1 verse 1 to chapter 2 verse 23 is the prologue or the birth and infancy of Jesus. After that, we begin the teachings of Jesus in 5 sections. So Matthew chapter 3 verse 1 to chapter 7 verse 29 is the first section. In this, the narrative part is proclamation and appearance of the Messiah. And then the teaching part is on the Sermon on the Mount. The second section is Matthew 8 verses 1 to chapter 11 verse 1. It contains the narratives. The narrative contains miracle in Galilee, and the teachings from it is the mission of the 12. Then we have Matthew, the third section, Matthew 11 verse 2 to chapter 13 verse 52. In this, the narrative is the growing hostility, and then the teaching is the kingdom of heaven. Then we have the fourth section, the fourth teaching, that is chapter 13 verse 53 to chapter 18 verse 35. Here the narrative is a shadow of the cross, and the teaching is the church. Then the fifth section is chapter 19 verse 1 to 25 verse 46. The narrative is the way to Jerusalem. Teaching is eschatological. The last part is Matthew 26 verse 1 to chapter 28 verse 20. This is the epilogue. It talks about the passion, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. These are the 5 sections, that is the 5 teachings of that is found in the Gospel of Matthew. So another way that we can outline this chapter is in terms of the 3 years of ministry of Jesus Christ. Okay, this was the Gospel of Matthew. Let's quickly move to the Gospel of Luke. Luke gives us the full story of Jesus that we possess. So he is the person who has basically researched a lot, and he talks about the whole story of Jesus, right from his birth. Okay, he also includes the genealogy. Okay, right from his birth till the end. Okay, he does not even stop at the resurrection. He talks about after the resurrection what happened. He met the disciples. He met on on the way. Okay, so that is also mentioned. So he has covered the whole of it. So let's go ahead. So author, the preface makes it clear that the writer is not an eyewitness. The author is not an eyewitness, but he has compiled it from the reliable sources, the first-hand sources, by careful research and investigation. A lot of research, a lot of investigation, properly done, carefully done by Luke. The gospel does not mention the author's name, but traditionally it is ascribed to Luke, the physician, a close associate of Paul. So again, the gospel does not say that Luke is the author, but in between you will find I, me, and all those things. Okay, so but from beginning only it is said that it is Luke, the physician, who has written the gospel, who was an associate of Paul. Now Eusebius links it to Luke, saying he was a native of Antioch in Syria. Luke is the only Gentile. Okay, this is something you should note. Luke is the only Gentile or a non-Jewish author in the whole Bible. Okay, so Bible also includes a non-Jewish person, a Gentile, as an author. Date. The book of Luke and Acts was written as two parts of a sequel between 60 to 70 AD. It was written shortly after Paul's 2 years of imprisonment, that is in 60 to 70 AD, mentioned in Acts 28, verse 30. Audience. Who were the audience? Luke writes to a Gentile audience. Okay, he writes to a Gentile audience, specifically for a Gentile, perhaps Roman convert, whose name is Theophilus. It was aimed to help Gentile converts become established in faith. So it was written to strengthen the faith of the Gentiles. Now let's look at the characteristics of Luke's gospel. Luke's gospel is a universal gospel. It is a universal gospel. It emphasizes that the gospel is for everyone. Okay, it's not only for the Jews, it's for everyone. It's for the Samaritans and the Gentiles as well. This is seen from the fact that the genealogy of Jesus starts with Adam. Okay, it does not start with Abraham too. As in Matthew, it starts from Adam. Okay, Adam. He is called the light of revelation to the Gentiles. Okay, he is called the light of revelation to the Gentiles by Simeon in chapter 2, verse 32. A Gentile centurion is commended for his faith in chapter 7, verse 9. A Samaritan comes back to thank from among the 10 healed lepers who were all Jews, chapter 17, verse 16. So one Samaritan who came back to, thank with a gratitude that he has been healed, and the rest of the Jews, they did not come back. A despised Samaritan is the hero of one of the greatest parable. Okay, the Good Samaritan, chapter 10, verse 30 to 35. Then he omits the story of the Syrophoenician woman given in Matthew and Mark, probably because it would have offended the Gentile readers. Okay, so he has omitted that story. So he has used so many instances and testimonies of people who were all Gentiles and who had been, transformed, and who have been healed, or their lives have been changed through Jesus Christ. Okay, and how they say what they say about Jesus Christ. Okay, so that is something very beautiful, that this is a universal gospel, and he has included all the Gentiles in it. Secondly, it is a gospel of rejoicing. Okay, it starts with the angel's message, I bring you the news of great joy. And then it ends with the disciples return to Jerusalem with great joy. It has several songs like Zechariah, or songs of Zechariah, Song of Mary, the Magnificat, and the Simeon song, and the angels singing. Okay, so it is a joyful book, a book of rejoicing. Then it is a gospel of down and out, or downtrodden, down and out. Okay, the marginalized, the gospel of them. Jesus is eating with the tax collectors and the sinners, chapter 5, verse 30. The gospel is that the Son of Man who came to seek and to save the lost. Okay, Jesus is the Son of Man who came to seek the lost, and who came to seek and save the lost. Chapter 19, verse 10. It is shown in the sinful woman. Okay, it is shown in the sinful woman, hated tax collector, and even in the dying thief receiving salvation at the cross. The despised shepherds receiving the news of Christ. Okay, we know that the shepherds were not liked by the Jews. Okay, so they received the good news of Jesus at his birth. Then it gives three parables of the lost coin, the lost sheep, and the lost son, all lost. Okay, chapter 15. Then the parable of Lazarus and the dives and the rich fool. Then Mary's song, he has filled the hungry with good news, good things, but sent the rich away empty. Okay, chapter 1, verse 53. Okay, so even the Beatitudes, maybe we can see over there, the blessed are the poor. It's not poor in the spirit that Luke writes, blessed are the poor, he writes. Okay, so he has a very different way. So he talks about the down. He includes a down and out. He includes a downtrodden. He includes the Gentiles. He includes those people who are marginalized, who were who are thrown away by the society, who were trampled by the society. So he takes them and lifts them up in his gospel. So it is a gospel for them. It is a gospel for the woman. Okay, the fourth characteristic, it is a gospel for the woman, or it is woman's gospel. Luke shows his respect and reverence towards womanhood. The stories of the pregnancies of Elizabeth and Mary are delicately recorded. The tragedy of motherhood is seen in the widow of Nain. The list of women who cared for Jesus in chapter 8, verses 1 to 3. The faithful woman right to the end. So even in the end, at the tomb, there are women who received, who saw Jesus and who were witnesses of Jesus and who cared for Jesus. Okay. Next, it is the gospel of supernatural. He emphasizes on angels, details of miracles of healings, the births as a fulfillment of angels' promise, etc. So there is so much supernatural happening in his gospel. Lastly, it is a gospel of prayer. He teaches the necessity of prayer, shows Christ as an example for believers in praying. Jesus prays. Jesus' prayer, very famous. Jesus' prayer before selecting the disciples. He selected the disciples after a lot of prayer. At Peter's confession, at the transfiguration, and before crucifixion, the parable on the prayer of the Pharisee and the publican with the treatise on the prayer following it. So we can see he talks a lot about prayer. Okay, Luke, he's a Gentile. Okay, he is a Gentile physician. He talks a lot about prayer. Okay, so we can see these are the characteristics of Luke's gospel. Okay, let's look at the outline. Luke chapter 1, verses 1 to 4, the preface. Chapter 1, verse 5 to chapter 2, verse 52, the parentage and infancy. 3, verse 1 to 4, verse 13, preparation, action of John the Baptizer and Jesus. Luke 14, 4:14 to 8:56, the return to Galilee. Then 9, chapter 1, chapter 9, verse 1 to 50, the third tour. Chapter 9, verse 51 to chapter 19, verse 27, the later Judean ministry. Chapter 19, verse 28 to chapter 22, verse 13, the Passion Week. Chapter 22, verse 14 to chapter 23, verse 56, the last hour. Chapter 24, verses 1 to 52, the resurrection and ascension. This was the gospel of Luke. Okay, so today in today's class, we studied or surveyed rather the gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Okay, these were the synoptic gospels. Okay, so this is all for the synoptic gospels part. In the next chapter, we'll be talking about John's gospel. Okay, the gospel of John, and then we'll be talking about the Acts of the Apostle. Okay, in this unit, and then we'll be jumping into the epistles. Okay, so so we'll be continuing in this format. So thank you, and God bless you as you listen to this lecture and learn from them. Stay blessed.